Tonight on The Week in 60 Minutes, we're going to look at Brexit, vaccines, and the US election, and then we're going to take your questions, both oral questions and written. We thank again the NatWest Group for their support for this program. They backed the first program we put out last week, and they've kept the faith with us this week. NatWest is the biggest supporter of businesses across the UK and is working hard during the pandemic to help businesses and personal customers get through this difficult period. Now, to launch the Spectator TV, we're only 1 week old, and we're giving viewers the opportunity to try 12 weeks of the magazine in print and online for just £12. I mean, we're almost giving it away. And you receive a £20 Amazon gift voucher, absolutely free. So, I mean, £12 for £20, even I can do the arithmetic there. Go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer and become a Spectator subscriber today with Amazon there. Amazon, as you know, they struggle to make any money in Britain and they pay such massive taxes. I think last year they paid at least 50 quid. So it's only right we give them a little boost as well. Now, first to Brexit. Brexit is back with a vengeance this week. And there's been some breaking news just in. There's a dramatic week with Brexit and Boris Johnson's government admitting that it plans to break international law to rewrite parts of the withdrawal agreement. This afternoon, surprise, surprise, Brussels hit back. The EU has threatened the UK with legal action if it does not ditch a bill to override key parts of the Brexit divorce deal by the end of the month. So how will the government respond? The Brexit trade talks about to break down well before the Prime Minister's own deadline. They were taking place this week. Not much of a breakthrough seems to have happened. We have the Spectators, Fraser Nelson, James Forsyth and Katy Balls here to answer these questions and more. James, let me come to you first. Talks took place this week. Not a lot seems to have happened. The government admits that it's doing something illegal. There's uproar. The EU is now going to take us to court. You couldn't really say that we were heading seamlessly to a free trade deal, could you?
Yeah, I think the drama is ramping up, and I don't see either side backing down. The government aren't going to drop this internal market bill that has so enraged the EU, and the EU isn't going to stop insisting on the full enforcement of the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. The only way out of this deadlock I can see is a breakthrough in either the Joint Committee or the trade talks. Now, the UK side are insistent that this is not a strategy to crash the talks. They say that they're trying to create a moment of reality here. And they argue that this week's talks have actually been, low bar admittedly, more constructive than the last few rounds. They think that developments this week have made both sides look over the precipice of what would happen if there isn't a deal. And they hope that might inject the urgency into the talks that might create the movement needed for a deal. But I think this is a very, very high risk, high stakes game they are playing, because you not only see the EU threatening to take the UK to court, but you see Joe Biden making clear that there's no trade deal on his watch if this happens.
No. And Nancy Pelosi has been making that clear as far as she's concerned in the House.
And so I think they are playing a very high stakes game, and they are trying to ramp the pressure up in the belief that that will create the space for concessions. I think the danger is that the EU side are determined to kind of respond in kind. And if you think back to last October, there was an opportunity when Boris Johnson, Leo Varadkar went to that hotel in Cheshire and they walked around the place. They could come up with a deal. The problem now, in that situation, you only really need to square the Irish to get a deal. This time round, you need to square 27 countries, and that is a far more difficult job.
Katy, what are the Tory backbenchers saying? I mean, when you have a staunch Brexiteer like Michael Howard, former Conservative leader of the opposition, no one believes in Brexit more than him, and he says the government was wrong to go down this illegal route. What's the mood on the Tory backbenches about this, frankly, pretty unprecedented situation the government's got itself into?
Well, I think in truth is actually quite a mixed reaction. And we saw in the Lords, you mentioned Michael Howard, also Norman Lamont. It's not a great look when I suppose the most senior Tory Brexiteers in the House of Lords are saying they can't support the government on this. I think if you look in the House of Commons, there's a little bit more sympathy or perhaps necessity to stay on board with number 10 for various reasons. So you're not seeing a big backlash. We have had a handful of MPs come forward, some Brexiteers, some MPs that you might call the usual suspects, ones that were unhappy with prorogation back when number 10 did that, and speak out and voice their concerns. Tom Tugendhat talking about the importance of the rule of law. But I don't think we've seen that vocal rebellion, which suggests that you'd have problems passing this in the Commons. But behind the scenes, there is a lot of disquiet. And I think this is because what is clearly, we can debate when international law has been broken previously, and there's lots of people who want to do that. But what is completely unprecedented is having a cabinet minister stand at the dispatch box and say, we're breaking international law, and not even try and, say, well, actually, you can argue this and look here. And I think that there are lots of Tory MPs who want to be supportive to the government on this. They clearly see Brexit as the flagship policy of this government, but they feel as they've been given nothing that they can even point to, not even a fig leaf here. And I think that's led to quite a lot of annoyance, even if it's not going public. And also just a sense that there was no build-up. There was no, ahead of this announcement. And it wasn't a slip by Brandon Lewis, as far as we know. This was the script, but there was nothing to let.
Well, that's the point, Kate. I wanted to ask you about that. When I saw the Northern Ireland Secretary say this at the dispatch box in the Commons, the words, yeah, we are breaking the law, but it's in a limited and specific way. I wonder if he just blundered, but am I right in thinking these words were scripted for him? He had them written in front of him.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of people, as you did, when we saw that, we thought, that clearly can't be what he's supposed to say. He's fumbled his lines. Actually, I think that was the script. And I think that was for a few reasons. One being that there is a sense in number 10 that if you look at the bill that was later published, there's not that much to quibble about. It was quite obvious what they were doing. But also, I think there was a sense that, I had one figure in government even say, we're not getting any credit for being honest, thinking perhaps there was
so they're honest criminals. They want credit for being honest criminals. Is that the government line?
That I would say that is a niche position, but it is one I have heard in the past few days. It did raise eyebrows. So Brandon Lewis meant to say what he did. And I think that is, again, another factor here, because Tory MPs are getting quite frustrated, thinking, you're not giving us much to work with. I think that people who are supportive generally still have faith that Boris Johnson and his team know what they're doing with Brexit. But I think what has happened this week, and as you were talking about earlier, the backlash internationally and what we're seeing currently in the Lords show that I think that you can argue this has backfired.
James, you wrote this week that the Prime Minister feels the EU has us, the United Kingdom, over a barrel on Northern Ireland. Can you just remind me, wasn't it the same Prime Minister that actually jumped into that barrel?
Yeah, I think this is the issue. This is the tension here, which is it's not, the UK isn't just proposing to break international law. It is proposing to not abide by obligations that come from a treaty that this Prime Minister signed and that this Parliament passed. Various people say, oh, no Parliament can bind its successor. Well, the Parliament that has bound itself is actually this current sitting Parliament that voted through the withdrawal agreement. And I think that is the tension. I think what the UK side is trying to do is trying to say to the EU, look, there are going to be consequences in the event of no deal, and we'll take action to preserve the integrity of the UK in those circumstances. I think the danger, though, is that this is a kind of high-risk strategy, because you talk to those people who are veterans of no-deal planning, and they say one of the most unpredictable elements of it is how the EU behaves. If the French decide to inspect every lorry at Calais, there are going to be significant delays. If they decide to operate a kind of fairly pragmatic, let's wave things through and only check things based on intelligence, then things might be much more smooth. But if the talks break down in total acrimony, it's hard to imagine that the EU will be particularly inclined to take a pragmatic view. I suspect they will want to prove a point. And I think this is what the danger of the approach is. Now, I will inject one note of caution here, which is, in some ways, before there is going to be a deal, there has to be a massive row of Brussels. Now, I think that Boris Johnson is genuinely convinced of the need for this approach. You know, he was integral to the devising of this strategy. It comes out of an away day that he held with his top political team about 10 days ago. But I think the point now is, if there is some movement now on the various issues, we could suddenly see, you know, I think that Boris Johnson still does want a deal, but he very much wants a deal kind of with the EU having moved rather than him.
Fraser, let's sum it up for us, please. Can you see a way forward here? I mean, are we all just reacting too quickly to the news? Is this all just the kind of brinkmanship that you would expect at this stage of negotiations? Is there still what are the chances of doing a deal, or are we heading for no deal?
I am still optimistic about a deal. I think it was always inevitable that there was going to be brinkmanship. We were going to get this kind of theatre coming in one form or another. It's too kind to say the government intended to do this. There's clearly been a massive mistake here in letting Brandon Lewis say what he said, a massive gift to the EU, who's exploiting it very cleverly. But ultimately, you know, for all of the missteps, it is within the interests of both Britain and the EU to do a deal. So last time around, we saw how the choreography went. It looked to all the world as if there was going to be no deal. We were preparing for it, but at the last moment, a deal came through. I've always expected we'd have the same pattern this time, and that a deal would come only at the last minute. So I suspect we're going to see a few more of these dramas here before the year is out.
I said that was the last word, but I do want to just go back to James, because something has just crossed my mind, and a number of people have been asking it. Because James points out there was no need for Brandon Lewis to say what he said. He could simply have invoked Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has safeguards and ways, if there are disagreements, for the British government to pursue these things. But James, just mark our card on this. If there is no deal, on a free trade agreement, does the withdrawal agreement, which has already been signed and in law, that still has legal status, whether we sign a deal or no deal? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And that is why the government needs to legislate for this, because if there is no deal and no agreement in the joint, or government feels it needs to legislate for this, if there is no deal and no agreement in the joint committee, you would be in a situation where every good that goes from Great Britain to Northern Ireland would have to pay tariffs. Now, that money would be refunded in time if you could prove that that good had stayed in Northern Ireland.
That it didn't slip over the border into the Republic.
Exactly. But that would essentially dislocate Northern Ireland from the UK economy. Now, when you put it to people, senior people in government, why didn't you use Article 16? They say, the problem with Article 16 is that it would get adjudicated in the European Court of Justice and you wouldn't win the case. I think the argument is, though, is that the UK has massively stepped off the moral high ground here. And I think that you could start saying that the EU's refusal to, for example, agree that British supermarkets that export to Northern Ireland can have their goods inspected at their depots rather than, you know, when they arrive in Northern Ireland. You could say, look, that is not negotiating in good faith. And because the EU is not negotiating in good faith, we're going to do this. I think if you look at Michael Howard and Norman Lamont's comments, what is causing the unease is the UK government saying that it is going to be the first mover in terms of breaking the agreement, rather than accusing the EU of breaking the agreement. And I think, you know, as someone said to me this week, you know, this is what Brandon Lewis said is worse than a crime. It's a mistake.
Right. That's a good point to leave it. But of course, we'll be back on Brexit. It's not going away. And it has come back with a bang. Now, this week, as you all know, the government tightened its COVID restrictions. It seems sometimes the only way out of this whole problem is the £100 billion moonshot testing project, if you believe in that, and in unicorns too, or a vaccine. This week, there was concerning news for the UK's best hope in the vaccine race. The Oxford vaccine trials with AstraZeneca were suspended after a trial patient fell ill. However, the race to find a COVID jab is more intense than ever. There are now 7 major contenders in the final stages, or at least what may be the final stages, across the globe. And which one wins will have consequences, not just for COVID, but for our lifestyles, but for geopolitics as too. Let's go to Fraser. He's going to talk us through this week's Spectator cover story, which is on this very subject. Fraser.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, yes, when we saw Chris Whitty and Boris Johnson declare last night that they're going to do these more restrictions, there was also a phase in the presentation where they were saying they were optimistic, very optimistic about not just the moonshot of doing several rapid kind of do you have COVID or not tests, but the vaccine itself. Now, until a few days ago, the British vaccine was seen to be the one ahead. The whole situation is depicted rather wonderfully by our cover artist, Morten Morland, this week. So it is something equivalent to the space race here, with each country coming up with its own vaccine. Now, of course, they're all doing it for the greater good of mankind, but when you look at the sort of names which they're given, it's something out of a Bond film. We talk about the Oxford vaccine. Well, it's half Oxford, half AstraZeneca. And here we can see Boris Johnson's Matt Hancock clinging on to it. There's £14 billion of government money here. And they've been trying to minimize how much of a problem it was that this week when one of the people who was on the trial fell seriously ill. They've had to pause that trial now while they investigate. Now, Matt Hancock says this is perfectly normal for vaccines. It happens all the time. He said it was actually the second time this has happened. But nonetheless, none of the other 8 contenders have had to pause the trials. So this has put some question as to whether the British vaccine, which had been given to more people than any other, really was in front. But also this week, we had some interesting news from the Russian vaccine, which is gloriously called Sputnik. Now, we might laugh at this, but The Lancet did a review a few days ago saying it's actually been very encouraging phase 2 trials. And
Mr. Putin, I'm told, has taken it, and his daughter has taken it as well.
Well, Putin has declared it safe personally. He's actually gone so far as to approve it, which is perhaps going a bit, but he said his daughter is feeling very well. That's what he told us a few days ago. So there we are. But the Russian and the British vaccine are the same sort of formula. You will give, so they're very similar. Both. Now, of course, there's questions asked as to how real the phase 2 Russian trials were. One of the experts out there has said it looks photoshopped to him, but we'll see. We can expect this sort of comings and goings, but not to be outdone. We've got Donald Trump on Operation Warp Speed. This is seriously the name which he's given to the attempt to get something like 300,000 vaccines ready, 3 million vaccines, ready by January. Now, he rather unnerved people a few days ago by saying that he's confident the American vaccine will be ready by a certain date. Of course, we all know what date he meant. He meant election date. Now, that had led all 8 vaccine manufacturers to put out a statement assuring the world that they would not be rushing this. There would not be any undue haste in finding a vaccine. But this does matter, of course, because there's 2 major theories about COVID right now. The Swedish approach is that a vaccine might never emerge, so you've got to learn to live with the virus, that you will keep managing it as long as the virus doesn't overwhelm the health facilities, then that's okay. Now, the Swedish approach, after it went wrong initially, it ended up almost as bad as Britain in terms of deaths per capita. But as of a few hours ago, Sweden is now back on the list to which Brits can travel because its levels are so far down. They're about half the level of Belgium, but Belgium is still the model which the British government is following because it saw a rise in cases, and the British government thinks that Belgium acted quickly and effectively to reverse that rise in cases. So strangely, we are now on the Belgian. So this is why we're getting the cycle of the rule of 6, as Boris Johnson calls it, this rather Game of Thrones style name is given to his rule that no more than 6 people are allowed to gather together. We can expect more. I understand ministers were discussing a curfew. We're discussing exemplary police raids where they go and raid some bunch of unsuspecting students, because number 10 thinks that Britain as a country needs to be a lot less confident, a little bit more concerned, even a bit more fearful, and that behavior might slow the stem of the virus. When the Swedes had tests surging, they thought, well, as long as hospital numbers don't go up, it doesn't matter. So 2 very different approaches.
As I understand it, Belgium has the worst record in terms of fatalities per million, even worse than the United Kingdom. Exactly why are we following Belgium?
Well, we had Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, describe it as a choice between three countries' approach: Spain, France, and Belgium. He shows some graphs saying that Spain has allowed their second wave infections, if it really is that, to surge out of control, that France did the same thing, but Belgium moved quickly. And Whitty's graph shows the second wave of Belgian infections stopping halfway through and then falling away.
Because they brought in restrictions.
They did. They brought in curfews. In Antwerp, you weren't allowed to go out after 11:30. There was even a supermarket sweep style rule where you're only allowed to spend 30 minutes in the supermarket. So rules in Belgium, which went way beyond what we had even in lockdown. But if that's the model, if we are pursuing a strategy which wants to have as few COVID infections as possible, then we can expect a lot more of restrictions. This week's curbs could be the beginning of a lot more to come.
The government and its chief medical officer is undoubtedly right that there's been a resurgence in cases in France and Spain. That's been happening for several weeks now. But as of yet, there's been no dramatic change in the number of fatalities in these countries. They've risen, but they've risen from a very small base. The relationship in France and Spain between cases and fatalities is nothing like what it was at the height of the crisis in April, May, and June.
That's right. That ratio between the number of deaths and the number of cases is through the floor all over Europe right now. Now, what Chris Whitty would say is that don't be fooled. There is a lag. You might think the cases are rising now and there's not deaths, but those deaths will come because the young transfer it to the old. Then there's a lag of hospital numbers. Then there's a lag of deaths. So if the Whitty hypothesis is correct, then we will start to see a rise in French deaths and a rise in Spanish deaths before too long. He says there's about a 3-week lag between the actions he's taking now and what he expects to see in Britain. So in a way, he's gambling. He's gambling that the Swedes are wrong to think that you can tolerate a rise in infections as long as there are no hospital levels. He wants to preemptively move now, but he hasn't convincingly explained why he's sure that the Belgian approach is so much better than the Swedish approach.
Okay, Fraser, thank you for that. Let's look more at this vaccine issue now. I'm delighted to say we're joined by Dr Elisabetta Groppelli, a virologist and lecturer in global health at St George's University of London. She's an expert on the development of novel and affordable vaccines. Dr Groppelli, welcome to the week in 60 minutes. Can I just clarify, because we all got a bit nervous when we saw this setback of the Oxford vaccine, as we're calling it, this week. But am I right in thinking that actually what has happened is entirely normal in the development of these vaccines?
Absolutely. It is very frequent that clinical trials, especially as they go into the last phase, which is called phase 3, which also involves lots of thousands of volunteers, but also involves different countries. It's very, very often that it happens that the trials needs to be paused because trials are skewed very much towards the side of caution, in the sense that as soon as something happens, everything just pauses so that an investigation can occur. And sometimes the most important question is actually to investigate if what's being detected as an adverse reaction is actually due to the vaccination. And as we've heard for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, there has been already a pause only a couple of months ago that actually was not linked to the vaccine, and therefore the trial could go ahead. But this is also why normally we do take years, decades to develop a vaccine. And so this is expected. And I would like to put into the context, at the moment, there have been 2 pauses in the vaccine trial for Oxford out of at least 18,000 people who have received the vaccine or the placebo. And this is astonishing. These are human beings that actually go about their own lives. And it's found that actually out of 18,000 people, someone will fall ill, also independently of the vaccine. So we need to take this into consideration as well.
And I understand you are one of the 18,000, doctor. You've been a volunteer for the vaccine. Tell us what the process is like.
Yes, absolutely. It's for me, it was absolutely a no-brainer in terms of signing up as a volunteer. Of course, I have the benefits of the knowledge of virology and also knowing my colleagues, but it's also virology in action. I was I signed up for the trial as soon as it opened in the UK, outside of Oxford. I am based in London, and this was early in May. And then there's been follow-up visits so that I could get a blood test to see how my body was reacting. At that moment, I didn't know if I had been given the Oxford vaccine or the placebo. And then basically I can obviously share that I am perfectly fine. And although obviously I am being monitored because this is part of the trial. So earlier this week, I did receive an email from the trial organizer notifying me about the adverse case, that the illness that had been diagnosed and the investigation that was pending. And to be honest, again, as a virologist, I was kind of expecting it. So for me, there hasn't been any apprehension or any disappointment. Just take it in a stride and wait for the investigators independently to assess what it is, and keep filling in the questionnaires about my potential exposures and how I feel.
Because I understand that what hangs over all these, every time we try to develop a vaccine for something, is a case that goes back to America, the Carter case in the 1950s, when I think they were trying to develop something for polio, and they ended up with the injections actually injected a lot of young people with the polio itself. And that was such a horrendous outcome that ever since we've had to be very cautious in going down this road. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, it has to be said that now we do have different platforms, different technologies that actually do not rely on what we call growing the virus or live virus, and that actually has to be killed before it can be given to volunteers. And this is also why these vaccines, like the Oxford vaccine, can be fast-tracked without the shortcuts, but they can be fast-tracked because they are very different. They are very novel generation of vaccines that already, because of the virological principles that are at the fundamentals of their designs, are already safer. Having said that, they could be fast-tracked, but the experiments or the experimentations actually still needs to be done according to the new rules, or the rules, the current rules, which are very much safety first. And this is also phase 1 and phase 2, and then efficacy. And I'll just would like to comment about, the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik 5, yes, which has been just pointed out, that is a technology very similar to the one with Oxford. And in that case, however, it has only been given to less than 100 people, while the Oxford vaccine already 18,000. So this is the massive difference. When we talk about a front runner, when we talk about different vaccines being developed, actually, there are quite a lot of differences in the numbers that actually can give us a little bit of an insight if a setback is important or not. 2 out of 18,000, it's pretty good stats at the moment for me.
Does it worry you that we seem to have there's almost like a sort of geopolitical vaccine nationalism going on here? And the giveaway from the Spectator's cover story this week, of course, it is that Russia's called it Sputnik 5. Mr. Trump is calling his the Operation Warp Speed. I mean, is this a good thing in that they're all competing like mad and to try and be the first, or is it actually something that's a bit scary?
Well, in science, actually a little bit of competition, even if it comes from national pride and a little bit of stereotypical Cold War scenarios, is actually quite good, because the more brains we have tackling a problem, the better we are at coming up with a solution, and a solution that might not be just one, but because we might need actually more than one. So a little bit of competition that actually fuel and bring the best out of us us, absolutely, is fantastic. However, this has to stop the moment something vaccine has been deemed safe and effective, because this is the moment when we need to absolutely make sure that a vaccine is made available for the entire world. This is a pandemic. Fine, let's have a race if we want when it comes to developing a little bit of national pride, but let's not forget that this is a nasty virus, it causes death, and the vaccine, the solution, needs to be available for every human being in this world.
Across the globe, yeah, indeed. Should we be worried though, supposing Russia gets on well with its vaccine, given the number of people that's been tested, they may add more to it and so on, more trials, but would we in Britain and Europe and the United States, would we not be a bit nervous about this? Because it would not have seemed to have mounted the hurdles that we would expect for our own vaccines.
Absolutely. The most important thing is that there are European regulators and also UK regulators that they want to and need to assess the data before anything is approved. At the moment, there is also a little bit of debate about, obviously, we said, about Brexit, about exactly what's going to be the path that the UK will use to actually approve a vaccine that has not been developed in the UK itself. But one thing is clear, whatever applies in terms of criteria for safety and efficacy to the Oxford vaccine will apply to any other vaccine that comes out anywhere in the world. And therefore, we will want to see the data, solid transparency before it is actually allowed for use, for license for use in the UK.
So if our authorities and our regulators and medical experts like you, if they say, look, this Chinese vaccine, all this Russian vaccine, it is safe to use, you'll be saying that on the basis that it's passed all the tests that we would have expected the Oxford vaccine to pass to.
Absolutely. Before we can allow it in this country, we will want to see the data, but also there will be and the data not as published, but also the nitty-gritty of the data, and be absolutely convinced by the data. There cannot be any doubt that maybe something has been photoshopped. Absolutely, that's the case, and so it's great that there is, as I said, competition, speed. But there cannot be shortcuts, and the transparency of the data will have to be there for actually make sure that, or get convinced that whatever the Russian or the Chinese vaccines are actually appropriate for our country.
Dr. Groppelli, just one final question. As I understand it, COVID is a variant of the common cold. And we don't have a vaccine for the common cold, even though it's been around forever. That would strike me that we're trying to do it all at huge speed as well, as you've been telling us. That would strike me as that it's a hell of a challenge.
Yes, it is. Vaccines are, viruses are, and so many other pathogens. I need to point out that the common cold, so what we call the common cold, is actually caused by a variety of viruses. Some are coronaviruses, some are called picornaviruses. But you're absolutely right. We do not have a vaccine for the common cold, either caused by the picornaviruses or caused by the coronaviruses. And so for the coronaviruses especially, is that they are also quite new. They've been identified only a few decades ago. But the most important thing is that so far, the common cold has been, for the majority of us all over the world, not a particularly nasty infection. And it's only now
Except when it's man flu. When it's man flu, of course, it's very serious, as you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I hope, we should devote more resources actually to cure that, ameliorate that, for the benefit of women as well.
Absolutely. Dr. Groppelli, thank you very much for marking our calendar. It's been fascinating to listen to you, and good luck with all the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's move and go across the pond to the US elections. You're watching The Week in 60 Minutes. It's coming to you from Spectator TV. We thank our sponsor, the NatWest Group, for supporting our second broadcast and for the support they're giving businesses up and down the country in these difficult COVID times. We're 2 months away from the US election, a little less than that. It's early this year on November the 3rd. The campaign started late because Labor Day came late this year as well. The race for the 270 electoral college votes is well underway. Now, the national polls have Mr. Biden comfortably ahead, but in some of the key battleground states that will determine the election, things are beginning to look a little tighter. Wouldn't overdo that, but they're looking a little tighter. Let's go to the editor of the Spectator's US edition, Freddy Gray, for an update. Freddie, what can you tell us?
Well, Andrew, I think the major theme at the moment in the American election is uncertainty. And that's not just because the polls are dubious, it's because the actual process is in doubt at the moment. We're going to have a huge increase in the number of mail-in ballots. We think could be
postal
up to half,
votes, as we call them in Britain.
Postal votes, as we call in Britain. Could be up to half the number of votes. And already there are huge political fights erupting over whether they're legitimate, who counts what in each state and so on. And so you could get a situation, I think we're probably going to have a situation where we're not going to have a usual election night. And in the weeks that follow, we're going to have terrible contesting of results that will go on and on and on, and things will get very, very ugly.
I saw Freddie, some US commentators saying that on election night, as the results come in and they're being counted, these are the people who've gone to vote, Donald Trump will likely emerge the winner. And then when the mail-in votes, when the postal votes are counted in, and that could all be done perhaps by the Sunday, most of it, Joe Biden could be the winner.
Well, that's the great fear at the moment, is if Trump clearly wins on election night without the full counts in a lot of states, he declares victory.
Yes.
And then 5 days later, it's cancelled by the actual results. But there are also great fears that if Trump wins by a margin, a lot of Democrats are going to say the postal votes weren't counted properly, and it will be contested. So I think, fascinating as it is to look at the various states, and I hope we'll do that in a moment, I think the real worry at the moment is that whatever the result is, no one will be happy with it.
Why do they take so long to count the postal votes? I mean, I think in this country, we sometimes count them beforehand, or we count them on the day along with all the actual votes.
Well, there are a lot of people saying this is all fear-mongering and that actually the Postal Service will work fine. But there do seem to be substantial delays in the American Postal Service at the moment. And the worry is the overload will be so huge that it will cause substantial delays.
Freddie, take us through some of these swing states. I think you've got some data on places like Florida, which is key for Mr. Trump. I don't think he can win without it. North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Mr. Biden's home state. Minnesota, which is, I understand, I think it shows one of the states that Mrs. Clinton won, and maybe one of the few states that went Democrat that could go Mr. Trump's way.
Well, precisely. If we get this share screen going, that's the overall polling average, which I don't actually think is that useful because it's shown.
That's nationwide. That's the
nationwide.
Whole country.
Yeah, and it still shows Biden substantially ahead, a little tightening in the last few months, and then a little pulling away in the most recent polls. If we then move on to what is effectively the betting market on the next president's chances, you see around the time of the national conventions, you see a massive crossover, which is where the betting people decided that Trump was going to win. And then again, as we got away from those conventions, people start to trust Biden's victory a bit more. And I think that's very telling. I think the betting market's a much more reliable indicator than the national polls.
Well, you think that where people place their money is a better indicator than what people tell pollsters?
I absolutely do. I think it is. I think a lot of people, we know there's a shy Trump factor. Nobody knows quite how big it will be. The shy Trump factor would be people who don't tell pollsters they're going to vote for Trump and then do.
Right.
But those people might just say to pollsters, yes, I think Trump's going to do it. So I think the betting market is more interesting. But even in the betting market, you see Biden is ahead. So that's not necessarily good news.
I see that. 7 points.
For Trump. But the interesting thing comes down to these various key battleground states. And the biggest one, the big one for Trump in 2016 was Florida. So if we look at that, we can see that it's getting tighter. Again, you see a little flick towards Biden recently. But
one percentage point is well within any margin of error.
Well, so a pollster told me last weekend that you can probably account 5 points for a shy Trump vote. So that would suggest that Florida's looking pretty good for Trump at the moment. And then of course it moves on to other states, and we look to somewhere like North Carolina.
Because as in 2016, Freddie, he has to win. Mr. Trump has to win Florida, but that's not enough.
It's not enough.
He's gone.
I mean, he can lose Florida and still win.
But I think he can?
Yes, I think he can. But I think it's a very, very difficult path to do so. And
he has North Carolina, you're showing us again. Close.
He has North Carolina is going to be very, very tight. And the big question in North Carolina is a large African-American vote. The African-American vote famously was quite depressed in 2016. They weren't that excited about Hillary Clinton. The early indications are that they were quite keen on the African-American voters were keen on Joe Biden. Will they come out for him in November? That will be very telling in North Carolina. At the moment, again, it's a total toss-up, as you can see from this chart. And so let's look to another state, which is Pennsylvania, which is a very interesting one because Trump won that by a very, very small margin in 2016. And Biden has this tremendous home advantage. He's a Scranton, Pennsylvania boy. He seems to have very solid polling there. But I've spoken to Republicans who think that they will still get Pennsylvania. And if they get Pennsylvania and a couple of other swing states, they don't necessarily need Florida. So
that's how the arithmetic works.
Yes.
I mean, the one thing that would seem to be clear is that Mr. Biden wins the popular vote. He'll, like Hillary Clinton in 2016, he will get more votes nationwide than Mr. Trump. But he still it is still not quite clear that translates into enough electoral college votes to give him victory.
Well, exactly. And I think what's very interesting is that, I mean, given that the Democrats have never really accepted the 2016 result, what happens if the same thing happens again? What happens if Trump loses the popular vote, which he almost certainly will, but wins the electoral college? How berserk do the Democrats go? Do they contest it to death? In one recent gameplay scenario, some senior Democrats suggested that they would propose that California succeeds from the Union if they win the popular vote but lose the electoral college again. So, I mean, I know this sounds hyperbolic, but I think we could be talking about serious constitutional questions, serious civil unrest if Trump wins again in that way.
So it sounds like there's, at least regardless of who's ahead, America between polling day and Christmas, or close to Christmas, could be heading for a serious constitutional crisis.
I think that's not,
unless somebody wins by a landslide.
Yes, unless somebody wins by a landslide, and then everyone will say it's a fix anyway. So.
And we're all waiting for the first debate, Freddie, on September the 29th. It's in Cleveland.
That's going to be great car crash television, I guarantee you.
We better see if we can get it on to Spectator TV then. At the moment, would it still not be fair to say, Freddie, that this is Mr. Biden's election to lose?
I think yes. I think given that this is pretty much in most Americans' minds, there seems to be a referendum on Trump. But Biden's great problem is that he's more successful when he's invisible from the electorate. And it's impossible for him to be invisible from the electorate as we approach an election. But as voters are actually confronted with the choice between two candidates, they start to realize it's a Biden versus Trump vote rather than a Trump versus I don't like Trump vote. And if it becomes a Biden versus Trump vote, then a lot of voters might start to realize that they're not that keen on Biden and they're not that keen on an Obama-era restoration, which is what Biden's proposing. Right.
Freddie, we'll leave it there, but we'll be back to that too. It's the most fascinating run-up I can remember to a US election. And of course, we'll all be watching that first debate on the 29th, not long to go for that. We've got about 15 minutes to go here on the week in 60 minutes. It's time now for your questions. We are going to take some that have been sent in, but I can also see some of you have your digital hands waving. Let me try a digital hand. We had a little trouble with these last week, but we got it in the end. Let me try Magnus Burt. Magnus?
I wanted to ask, about essentially the COVID treatments, which Cynergen, I heard, had developed a treatment which in a phase 2 trial has reduced the number of cases, not cases, I mean also severe disease, by about 80% in a phase 2 trial. This is very good and it reduces COVID death rates, even the risk of a second wave, significantly. Why
okay, let me go to Dr. Groppelli for that. There have been some treatments with some success as this COVID crisis is going on. Is that right, Doctor?
Yes, absolutely. The most important one has been dexamethasone, which is the very cheap drug that is already used in the clinic that has been shown to very much reduce the mortality for the most severe patients, so the ones that are already in hospital. And that has been a fantastic news that came out of actually of the UK run trial, the recovery trial. There has been a separate data about another steroid, which is another heavily and easily used, which is hydrocortisone. A bit more mixed data when it comes to an antiviral, which is called remdesivir. That acts not on the hormones of the human body, but acts directly on the virus. But unfortunately, the data is not as strong as the other ones. So lots of progress, nothing specifically a major game changer, but certainly a couple of drugs that are going to be helping the most severe cases. The ones that are being hospitalized.
All right, thank you for that. Simon Albury has written in with, what is Ofcom's beef with you, meaning the program? Simon, it was just a joke. Don't take it seriously. I'm sure Ofcom loves us there. Let's go to Lars Frevert, I think is how you pronounce it. It's an interesting question, James. I think it's for you. What is there to stop the government from breaching other parts of the withdrawal agreement? For example, the withdrawal agreement includes the provisions protecting European citizens' rights. I'm sure Dr. Groppelli would be very interested in the answer to that question. That's the problem, isn't it, when you try to claim you're just a little bit pregnant?
Yeah, and I think you can see the risk of opening Pandora's box, which is that there are some amendments coming from the European Research Group, the kind of really hardline Spartan Tory Brexiteers, trying to override more of the withdrawal agreement, not the sections on citizens' rights, I should stress, but more bits of the withdrawal agreement. Now, the government's defence is, look, this is the proof that we're not ripping up the withdrawal agreement. We're only taking this very targeted action. But the problem is, once you say that you're entitled to overrule one part of it, it becomes very hard to explain why you won't overrule other bits of it. And so I think the danger for the government is that it ends up under fire from two sides of its own party in the Commons next week. You know, one group of ERG rebels saying, we want more of the withdrawal agreement disapplied. And then we've already seen an amendment put down from Bob Neal and the former Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green saying, you know, you shouldn't be able to trigger these Northern Ireland provisions without another vote in Parliament because of the risk it would pose to the UK's international reputation.
Right, exactly. Now, here's another question that's come in, which an interesting one. It's a written question, and this again, I think, is for you, Doctor. If Britain does, if the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine becomes the front runner in this, does that mean that we in Britain get it first?
Right. Well, the really important thing is that the UK government has already bought a substantial number of doses and has ordered more. And the manufacturing process is obviously at the unlinked compared to the trial. So there is a manufacturing going on already before we know if the vaccine is safe and effective. And the idea is very much that as soon as there is the data and the licensing, then we can start vaccinating. So it seems like the UK is certainly in good place to get it when it's ready. There are, however, other doses that are being manufactured for other countries. And I think it's about, it's definitely important that the UK will have access to at least a few vaccines as soon as they are ready.
That question was from Ken Pelton. Here's an anonymous one. I'll stick with you, Doctor, for the moment. Could the government make any vaccine like this? Could it make it mandatory that we have to have it?
Right, there will be, it's, I would say unlikely, but in reality is virtually impossible in a modern Western democracy. And as much as a virologist, I would absolutely love to see everybody who can have a vaccine also take it. The reality is that we're not just virus hosts. We are human beings with a thinking brain, and therefore we need to be doing it willingly. So if someone has concerns about the vaccine and doesn't want to take it, I would invite conversations to be had, discussions, and yes, from my point of view, convincing that vaccines are not only safe but effective, and they are also, in this particular case, extremely useful to actually get us back to real life. So not mandatory, but certainly any doubts, please let's talk about this, because it's very important and they do work.
Right. Let's go to Terry Portman, who's got a question with a little blue hand up. Terry, over to you. Your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm curious about what we can do to stop more virus in the community. Here in Plymouth, we had a group come back from Zante, and 11 of them proved positive. But if you go and look at footage, Instagram accounts, etc., you can see that there's very little social distancing going on over there. Clubs are open, etc. So why has it taken 3 weeks for us to react to put this on a watch list, and so you can't travel there anymore, when it should have been obvious that there are countries that have got similar restrictions to us that are taking it very seriously, and then other countries that aren't? Why are we not looking at these things in a broad way rather than waiting for data?
Okay, Terry, thank you for that. Katie, let me go to you on this. It does seem that the government, I'm going to Katy Balls here, it does seem the government has struggled, particularly among young people as the universities are going back, or even in August when they got a chance to have some holidays and party. Social distancing pretty much fell by the wayside among that particular demographic, didn't it? The government just couldn't enforce it.
Yes, and I think that if you look at all the restrictions the government are currently talking about, so, you know, the rule of 6, when you speak to cabinet ministers about this, it goes back to young people. I think on Zante and certain holiday locations, the government has actually been quite worried about the fact that in certain places, it's younger groups, people relax more when they go abroad, and that has been a factor. But I think if we're looking ahead to what this means for the young going forward, we do have a situation where, looking ahead to university, I think that part of the reason we're getting these restrictions is because they're really worried about young people having all these late night gatherings. But the question is, I mean, I had one minister put it to me, the problem with young people is they drink a lot, and they have lots of sleepovers, adult sleepovers potentially, and they see that as an issue in this. But it's hard to know exactly how to play it, because we're talking about enforcement. How do we actually enforce this? Even though the government is talking about higher fines, I think there is an issue in putting that in practice, and they're probably going to try and make a big scene of letting go of a few people, of, you know, finding people, arresting people to try and put others off, because there's only so much they can do.
Porrick O'Brien asks, how seriously should we take the comments by Nancy Pelosi that there will be no UK-US trade deal if the government goes ahead with its internal market plans? I mean, Freddie, I think it's a bit more than that. What Nancy Pelosi has been saying is that if anything the British government does undermines the Good Friday peace agreement, that will make it much harder to get a free trade deal through. And I think whatever way we look at the election, it's pretty clear that the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi being the leader in the House there, they're going to hold on to the House. So it is a serious threat.
It is a serious threat. And it's also, I mean, the Irish question in America is still very, very interesting.
Indeed.
And then you think about the fact that Joe Biden is an Irish Catholic American. I mean, how does that reflect on how he'll treat a Brexit deal in light of Ireland? I mean, my impression is that the Boris Johnson administration for a while was very keen on the Trump administration. There was lots of high hopes about what could be done together on a trade deal. My impression is that those hopes have sort of dwindled a bit in recent months, and that if you talk to people in Westminster, they seem to be keener on the idea of a Biden administration, and that we could join a multilateral trading deal after Biden becomes president. So I think there's a sort of cooling off between the Johnson administration and the Trump administration.
And the Trump. Question from Sandeep Fazoo, again for our doctor. He wants to know what your thoughts are on mass testing, which the government has been bigging up recently. Is it realistic to be able, I mean, at one stage it's talking about kind of testing everybody regularly. Is that would, it's called a moonshot. It sounds to me it might be as far away as the moon, Doctor.
Yes, I mean, in principle, it makes sense. You know, we want to know where the virus is. Let's test everybody. And because the testing we have at the moment, they only tell us if someone is infected at the time that we take the test. So, and that can change 24 hours later. So, mass testing as frequent as once a day. Yes, logically, but in the hardcore reality of actually this planet, it's very unrealistic, not just particularly ambitious. And so, and also it actually hits a point which has been quite challenging for the UK, which has been not only testing in terms of increasing capacity, but also making the test available and also making the results available to those who are actually needed. So there's quite a lot of groundwork that needs to be done again when it comes to delivering the testing as we know about it before we can start thinking about massive mass testing. That it looks pretty much unrealistic, and unfortunately it would require actually validation and delivery of some technological platforms like the rapid test, which are not available at the moment, and it's unlikely that will be available anytime soon. So a little bit of realism, possibly a good idea, but let's stick to what we know works and do that at the best of our abilities.
Thank you for that, Doctor. James, let me come back to you in our final few minutes and inevitably come back to Brexit. We know what's happened this week. We know the talks have continued. Doesn't seem to they didn't break up, but there's not been much of a breakthrough. We've had this business with the British government and legality. We've had the EU now saying it's going to take us to court. Look ahead for us. We're now in the second week of September. What now happens with Brexit over the next month or so?
I think the big question with Brexit now is whether the principals get involved, by which I mean, does Macron, Merkel, the other EU national leaders get involved? Because I don't think the answer to these questions is going to come out of the Barnier-Frost discussions. There's got to be the political will to get a deal. Now, I mean, there's an interesting question here. Emmanuel Macron is the most obvious person, I think, to have the conversation with Boris Johnson that perhaps replicates some of that Lier Varadkar conversation last time around. The French are the most hardline, but also Boris Johnson has no better interpersonal relation with an EU leader than with Emmanuel Macron. They enjoy having dinner together, they get on.
They speak French together.
Indeed. I think one of the problems here is fish, because there is no good answer for Emmanuel Macron on fish, because the nature of the UK becoming a coastal state so cuts back on what French fishermen can catch. And I think one theory that is doing the rounds at the moment is that Macron doesn't want to step in, because if he steps in and helps broker a deal, he will have dipped his hands in the fish guts. And French fishermen will say, our catch is falling dramatically because of this deal that you brokered, Mr. President. Whereas if Macron sits back, waits for no deal, and then negotiate, and then steps in, in the second half of 2021, say, to try and work on a deal, French fishermen will go from having lost all of their quota in UK waters to then getting some back from the Macron deal. So I think there is a worry that Macron isn't going to step in because of his whole fishing question. The other big issue is Angela Merkel. Right now, the Germans hold the presidency of the European Union. She is very reluctant to step in too early. But as we saw again last time round when things looked like they were heading for no deal, she is very worried about the geopolitical implications, not the economic ones, but the geopolitical implications of a no-deal Brexit. And the question is, does she step in towards the last to try and broker a kind of compromise? She did do that last time round, albeit in a limited way. Does she try and do that again? And I think the reminder today is that you saw the E3, the UK, France and Germany, again taking the same position on Iran. You had the poisoning of Russia's opposition leader the other week. There are a whole bunch of geostrategic issues where the UK's alignment with the EU is very important. Does that prompt Angela Merkel to step in and try and find a way through this situation?
James, thank you for that. We're going to leave it there. Thanks to everybody for joining us from the Spectator team, and a special thanks to Dr. Groppelli for being with us tonight and talking us through these complicated matters. That is it for the week in 60 minutes. It was actually 63 minutes. We overran just a little bit. We'd like to know what you thought about it, how we could improve it. We're always out for improvement. So send your thoughts to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. Thanks to all of our guests, to you for watching, and once again to our supportive sponsors at NatWest Group and the work they're doing to help businesses during the COVID crisis. You can watch again or recommend the show to your friends. It'll shortly be ready for viewing on the Spectator website and on the Spectator's YouTube channel. We hope you'll join us again next Thursday at 6 p.m. London time for another week in 60 minutes. Until then, goodbye.